Well, Ray, that was great. That was really fun. It's always a treat to listen to you, and I love where you ended there because it reminds me of an answer I've been giving to people when they ask me about, woe is me, where are we going? And I always tell them, God's had a really good globalization period. From God's point of view, let's see, 300 million people came out of poverty faster in India and China than ever before. So it all depends on whose perspective you're looking at it from. But God's had a couple of really good decades, actually.
Yeah, I think so.
The problem is God doesn't vote in Brexit or in the American election. And so, and for us to keep this process going, because it can be stopped by or it can be slowed, I should say, by human intervention. What do you, when people come to you and say, how do we deal with that cohort, that the person who's driving a truck now, or a cab driver, or doing what I would call middle skilled work that is so easily digitized, automated, outsourced. What do we do for that cohort, and how do we do it fast enough so they don't put sand in the gears as we're seeing today?
Well, I agree with the observation that it is this anxiety that you've just described that underlies the political changes and anxieties that we're witnessing. It's not some of the culprits that have been identified. It is automation, but it's this perception. The perception is real for those people who lose their jobs. Some economists are saying, yes, you're right, Ray, that it's been a good process overall so far. We've been adding more jobs than we've been eliminating, but that's going to change because of the rapid pace of progress. I don't believe that's the case. I think we're going to keep up with it because we're going to, and we are enhancing ourselves with these technologies. Just in recent years, I mean, you look back 5 or 6 years ago, there's many industries like apps, of which there are millions, and many new ways of earning money that didn't exist 5 or 6 years ago. And the statistics that I cited, which are very dramatic over a century, are continuing in recent years. One way to manage it is through the social safety net. We had no social safety net at all before the 1930s when Social Security was put in place. Was that because society wasn't liberal enough to realize the importance of sort of protecting people? It really wasn't wealthy enough. And that was just step one. We have now a very elaborate social safety net. Some parts of it are controversial, some are sacrosanct, like Social Security. And people think there's a huge difference between left and right, but actually if you look at positions, nobody is saying, oh, let's completely dismantle the social safety net. And even with health care, it's that, once you give benefits that are important to people's well-being to certain people, it's very hard to go backwards, as we're seeing that in today's discussion. I think we're going to continue doing that. Society is getting wealthier, and we can afford more aspects of that. And we can, there's constructive ways to do that. Supporting education, for example, is a way of doing that. Bringing, just a simple thing like bringing online availability to everybody in the world. There are major initiatives to do that, is another aspect of it. Beyond that, I think it's a very important and legitimate social political issue. I would encourage programs where we make available training and for people who are going to be disrupted or have been disrupted to learn new skills and fit into the new economy. If you look at where we're going, it's not a negative picture. I mean, we will be able to provide the physical needs to build high-quality housing with modules printed on 3D printers and very inexpensive, high-quality food produced by vertical agriculture controlled by AI and the physical things that we need through 3D printing and so on. This revolution where this is, billions of times more powerful than the computers when I was a student is going to come to these things we don't associate with information technology. So we're headed to a place, I think, that's positive, We don't want undue anxiety en route. I know we all know from our own lives that economic insecurity and worry is a big psychological factor and motivator, and so I think we need to give people comfort while not losing incentives for people to contribute. It's an important. I mean, I think this conference is very important to address that. There's different ideas. We've already heard certain ideas that people like or don't like. I think it's. But there are ways to address it, and I think we're headed to a positive future.
One of the things I wondered about, I saw the first budget numbers for building a wall on the Mexican border, something like $1.8 billion in the first budget. I was thinking about it this morning, that what if you took that $1.8 billion and you actually installed 3D printing labs in every public high school in America on one condition, that they have to be open till 10 at night so adults can use them after school. We could actually spawn a whole new generation of artisans.
Well, I think it's a great idea. There's many ideas like that. You know, we actually don't teach coding and programming universally. I mean, some schools do. A lot of schools, it's kind of an extracurricular activity. I think it teaches a certain way of thinking, a logical way of thinking that's important, and it's a very important type of literacy. So there's many things we should be doing to prepare for the kind of future we're entering. The model of education, I think, is obsolete. What we tried to do at Singularity University is the idea of learn by doing. And my grandson just got into an elementary school where that is the philosophy. So there's versions of that at every age. If I think about what I've managed to learn in my career, it's not from formal learning of facts, but from having a passion for projects, and along the way you happen to learn something. And I think learn by doing is an important philosophy, and the idea of stuffing facts in kids' minds is already obsolete. We carry the facts around with us, but we need to translate that into positive changes in the world.
So let's talk about an organ that you didn't talk about specifically today, and that's the heart. One of my favorite interviews in the research I did was with Vivek Murthy, who's our Surgeon General. Amazing guy. And I was asking him one day, Ray, what's the most prevalent disease in America? Is it heart disease, cancer, or diabetes? And he said, it's none of those, it's isolation. And I thought, wow, we're in the most connected age in history, and the Surgeon General of the United States says that the most prevalent disease in the country is isolation. And it triggered a column I eventually did with my friend Dov Seidman, who basically, we used to work with our hands, as you pointed out. Then we worked with our heads. And in a lot of the age that you've really detailed, won't we really work with our hearts, that more connecting hearts to hearts? And when I wrote about that, I discovered that the fastest growing restaurant chain in America in 2015 is actually something called Paint Night, which is paint by numbers for adults in bars. Now, who would have ever thought that there would be a business for artists actually organizing group paint by numbers classes in bars? But it turns out a lot of people like to connect hearts to hearts in a social setting like that. I'm just curious what your thinking is in that realm.
Well, I think isolation is not a new issue. It is a very profound goal of life to be connected. This comes up in the desirability of life extension. People say, oh no, death gives meaning to life. And I say, no, what gives meaning to life is what you can do with life, including being connected and also being creative. But I can think of poems by T.S. Eliot and Allen Ginsberg I won't try to recite that talk about how people are very isolated. There's, of course, a whole debate, are these devices making us more or less isolated? And Sherry Turkle writes about how she walks in a room and everybody's on their devices and they're not talking to each other the way they used to, and pointed out, well, they're probably talking to someone else at the other end of that device, and we're creating communities based on common interest, and does help actually maintain connection, but technology is always a double-edged sword. Right. But I do think that's important. I mean, technology is not the answer to everything. I think people need to give a priority to being connected and caring about their loved ones, and giving a priority to seeing their children rather than going off on another business trip. And so these are old-fashioned kinds of ideas.
I'd be curious, I don't know if you heard Governor Christie this morning, but he really argued that politicians are a reflection of the public, and the public, ever since 9/11 and 2008, has really been driven, for the most part, by fear and anger. Fear because of 9/11, anger because of 2008, and that politicians are just reflecting that. And if we want different politicians, we need to demand, we got to move the cheese, that they're just reacting to where the cheese is. What do you think of that?
Well, I think the fear comes from what we just talked about a few minutes ago, from economic insecurity, partly because change is so rapid now that people can't figure out all the implications, and they've heard something that threatens their particular business model, and it's not clear to them how they're going to deal with it. And it's fine for us to say, oh, well, there's more people getting new jobs, but that's not you. That doesn't satisfy your economic insecurity, and that will manifest itself, I think, in destructive ways. And so I think finding a way that gives people security, where they can welcome change, but doesn't, eliminate incentive,
Yeah.
is critical. And I don't have all the answers for that, but we're probably not doing a great job at that. Along with rise in, say, nationalism and people identifying with certain groups, which can have negative consequences, I think there is a growing world culture where we're mixing together lots of cultures, and kids growing up today really are exposed to people all around the world and have friendships around the world. It's the first generation that's ever done that, and there's much more of a sense that they belong to humanity. That didn't used to be the case, so that might seem not to be the case if you look at certain political trends. Ultimately, I think this worldwide communication we have is a positive thing, but like I say, every technology since fire has both good and bad aspects. Fire kept us warm, cooked our food, but burned down our houses.
What do you say to people who say, well, there's really nothing new today? People felt this way when the steam engine came along, when the railroad came through town, when the telegraph started. Is today really that different? What do you say to that?
Well, it's part of a continuum, but the continuum is exponential and accelerating. So there was exponential change hundreds of years ago, but it would take a century to notice the difference. So your grandchildren your grandparents had the same lives you did, and you expected your grandchildren to do the same. That began to change in the 19th century. Now the idea that, okay, I'm going to learn this trade and practice that for 40 years and then retire, that model is really long since gone. And I think we need to teach children and adults how to create positive change, to welcome change, to be comfortable with it, to not feel that their security is tied to stopping progress. If we look at where we're headed, it can be a very positive world. But there's a role, it's not just technology, there's a role for historians and writers and journalists and philosophers and to guide us to where we want to go and what's important in life. But ultimately, I think we have the opportunity for people to be creative and get out of isolation by fostering relationships. But we want to get there without undue fear of the unknown.
If President Trump were here and you had a chance to give him one piece of advice right now, what would it be?
Okay, I haven't been asked that question before.
I haven't asked it before either.
Well, let me take a moment to think about that out. I would say that the anxiety that people feel, that his supporters feel, does come from technological insecurity spawned by the rapid change in technology. But at the same time, that's not something to be avoided because that's going to lead to a better life. So we need to find ways of giving people enough security while still maintaining incentive, as we talked about before. We need to change the model of education to do that, to celebrate innovation. And I would point out that our innovation has been made possible by all the world's people that we have here. You know, our television and culture and newspapers are read all around the world because we have all the world's people here. So we really understand all the world's people, and we have innovators, you know, like the founders of Google, who came from other countries just recently. So that was more than one thing.
That's okay. Did you get those, Jeff? Well, we'll pass them on. The incomparable Ray Kurzweil. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.